about Judaism. So I'm grateful for all of you for being here and for Professor Lebenz inviting me. I am, as Professor Lebenz told you, I'm the interim rabbi, which means that I participate in coming into congregations in transition and helping them through their next phase of development so that they're ready to bring in a permanent rabbi some point after I leave. I'm here specifically in Youngstown because the congregation had a rabbi who retired after having served the pulpit for 25 years. And also there's some conversations going on in the community about the potential consolidation of the Jewish congregations in Youngstown. Previous to that, I served also as an interim rabbi in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I was ordained in 1986. I was in New York as a congregational rabbi for 23 years. And then I took another 12 years or so working for different Jewish organizations, including the Bureau of Jewish Education in Indianapolis and the Jewish Federation of Madison, Wisconsin, before returning to the pulpit and serving as interim rabbi. I am a very proud graduate of the University of Wisconsin in Madison, where I got my bachelor's degree in political science, and then went to Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, which is where I received both my master's degree and my ordination and my honorary doctorate degree. And I also have a master's in business administration from SUNY Empire State College in New York. So that's my basic background. And I'm asked you to do a little bit of an exercise to talk about what rabbis, get a picture of who rabbis are and what they do. So I'm going to actually ask you a question first, which is, did you find anything surprising as you were doing that search? And if so, what they were? And just unmute yourself and tell us and share us what it was. So Abrielle, you look like you, okay?
If you don't mind, I'll go ahead and start.
Go, please.
I was raised very traditionally Catholic, so it's been so fascinating to do all this research and see so many people who are able to become rabbis who are transgender, LGBTQ, who are women, who are people of color, people of all backgrounds. And that's been really fascinating for me to see because, you know, in the Catholic Church, it's always like you see male priests and that's it. And there are very few openly gay priests. You know, I don't think I've ever heard of a transgender priest. So it's been really nice to see like such a large amount of diversity. And it's really interesting to see how that's varied between different like types of Judaism as well, like Orthodox Jews versus others. So it's been interesting.
Anybody else have any surprises? No? Okay, so just share with me for a minute one name of a rabbi that you found in your research. Name, where they were, something about them. I'm just curious who you stumbled on. Jason, go ahead.
If you could just give me one moment to pull up my notes that have their names, because I can tell you a lot of what they did, but I'm bad
we can play this in reverse game. Tell me what they did and see if I can guess who they are.
Okay. Well, so one of the tweets that I found that caught my attention that I thought was just kind of touching, and just it showed the interpersonal connection that rabbis can make with their congregants, was one from a woman. Her name was, Rabbi Emily Cohen. She talked about how one of the more important things that she does is go for coffee dates with members of her congregation, just to talk and to get to know them and to help to talk to them about anything that's troubling them in their lives. And yeah, like I'm like Gabrielle, I'm also raised Catholic, and I've never once had like a connection with a priest like that. Like I mean, we've had active priests in the parish that I was a part of, but even still, that wouldn't have been a commonplace there. And so that tweet and the responses from other people that talked about how important their rabbis were to them growing up and the connections that they built and how they grew over time with their rabbi, I thought that was pretty cool.
That's great. I actually have a colleague whose blog and her Twitter feed and all of that, her handle is Coffee House Rabbi. She runs a sort of independent community. She's been online for a long time. She predated COVID being, a very much a virtual rabbi. And she runs it out of the nearest coffee house in many ways, or at least used to run it out of the nearest coffee house. So that's a really nice thing. And that is, it's one of the things that's changed, especially the past 10 years, is the rise of what we call the sort of entrepreneurial rabbi. For most of us, the path out of school was from school to either an assistant rabbi position or a rabbi in a small town that was kind of regulated when I was ordained, and maybe working for a college campus as a Hillel rabbi, which is a college rabbi, sponsored. It used to be sponsored by a national organization. Now it's more locally sponsored. And those were sort of the paths. And the idea of rabbis going and doing coffee house rabbi or more entrepreneurial thing not only wasn't the way, we actually had, and still have to some degree, some ethical boundaries that surround how far you can do things like that if there's a congregation in your community, so you're not competing with your colleagues in that way. And that's also helped. Some of that has changed a little bit over time as well. So you saw that rabbis do different things. Rabbis are not just ceremonial functionaries. As a matter of fact, I can say that much of my time as a pulpit rabbi was not spent in the synagogue. And actually, the more time I spent in the actual synagogue building, the less I was almost doing for the congregation. It's built on going to meet people where they are, to teach, to be involved in community organizations, and our ceremonial functions are much more limited in many ways, particularly as Reform rabbis. Other rabbis who have services every day in their synagogue, sometimes 2 and 3 times a day in their synagogue, their lives are very different than those of us who are Reform rabbis who pretty much only have services on Fridays and Saturdays. So that's one thing that's very different. Anybody find anything else that was surprising and different? No. So give me the name of another rabbi you found. Somebody? No, Nolan, go ahead. Go ahead, Nolan.
All right,
we'll take Lexi next.
That works. So one of the ones I found was Alyssa Stanton, who was the first female African-American rabbi. What I found interesting about her was that she converted later in life to Judaism after college. And I found that a couple of rabbis, actually. So it's interesting to look about how they went about community building and how they incorporate their identities into being a rabbi. That's differently from other people who have come before them. So I thought that was an interesting aspect of how they kind of made their congregations after they got involved.
Okay. Lexi, who did you find?
I found Rabbi James Green, and he discussed his work with the New American program, which was basically a program that welcomed children into the U.S., which I thought was really interesting, and that it went beyond like the local Jewish community and helping people feel more inclusive. I couldn't find a lot of information about the New American program online, so I wasn't entirely sure if it was like a camp just for new Jewish Americans, but I'd assume so. I still thought that was like really interesting and powerful work.
Okay. Deborah, did you find anybody interesting?
Actually, I did not get the memo. I'm not on Twitter. The memo or the email that I got was about Rabbi Priestand and the video.
Okay.
So I did do some reading about Rabbi Priestand, and what an amazing woman. I'm just gobsmacked by people who take that first step and lead entire generations into new territory. It just astounds me that people have that kind of courage and fortitude.
Yeah, Sally's pretty. The amazing thing about Sally Priesand is she's also one of the most understated individuals I know as a rabbi. Rabbis tend to have fairly large egos, and Sally is a very she's just a wonderful human being and very giving. And we're just beginning the preparation because in 2022 we will have her 50th anniversary of ordination. And I'm part of a committee that's planning a conference that's going to be in June of 2021 that we're calling the Road to 50. And we're beginning the 50-year celebrations. So the celebration will be sort of complete on her actual anniversary. And it's really amazing. You know, she's just a giving, wonderful human being, and it's amazing to be part of this piece of history. I guess I should add, I was in the first 100 rabbis, women rabbis. It's a very different world from when I was ordained, much less when she was ordained. When she was ordained, she was when she first went into school, she was literally the only woman in the building on many occasions, since the faculty was not, there were probably no females on the faculty, and she was very much alone. And the women who came after her tell stories of, finding their books put back in the hallway, if they had gotten to the classroom first. It was a joke. But when I was a student, so when we go to school, our first year, we all go to Israel together. And then we split between 3 U.S. campuses when we come back: Los Angeles, Cincinnati, and New York. And just as a fluke, there were 9 students from my class in Los Angeles, and 6 of us were women, which was the first time that had happened, that there was a majority women's class. And every once in a while, you could see the professors kind of peering over the tops of their eyeglasses, wondering who the heck was in front of them. Because all of a sudden, somebody would come into the class, they would bring in people from the field to, talk about different aspects of being a rabbi. And they would say, the rabbi he. And after the second and third time of the rabbi he, one of us would raise their hands and say, could ya maybe include she? Because look at this room. And then inevitably one of them would pipe up, oh, it doesn't bother me. And it was just, it was a whole interesting dynamic now, which I'm still friendly with my classmates, which we kind of laugh about now when we see that what we were just, most of us who were in my class, we entered school in 1980. So Sally had been ordained for 8 years, and the school had started, after Sally, there was 2 and then 3 and then 5 women graduating a year. And by the time we were in school, the admissions and the process of getting in and being accepted was old hat already for the admissions process. But once we were there was still plenty of things that had not evolved in the same way. And the same was true in all of our pulpits as well. So Sally being the trailblazer was truly an amazing thing. Abrielle, did you find somebody in particular that you wanted to mention?
You're unmuted.
Go ahead.
Let me change that. There we go. I found one rabbi that was really interesting. They came out as bisexual, and a lot of the articles about them used she, her pronouns, but then several made it very much a point to use they, them, and said that they refer to themselves now as they, them. So I'm guessing they came out as non-binary on a later date. And they were just part of, like, they were a director of several different organizations, like the Alliance for Jewish Renewal. There was one organization called As the Spirit Moves Us. So it's just really interesting to see their long list of accomplishments, and that even after becoming a rabbi, they were still working through their own identity and coming out and everything. So it's neat.
Okay, John and Donald, did you find anybody?
Yeah, I found Reform Rabbi Jan Zaltzmer using that hashtag.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I found really interesting about a lot of the people using, a lot of the rabbis using that hashtag, and her in particular, was how incisive some of the political and social commentary and criticism can be, while still being sometimes very funny. But in her instance, she actually broke away, or was actually criticizing a lot of the kind of rhetoric that we find in some religious spaces, which of that sometimes hard conversations need to happen about very important topics, and that sometimes we like to be very accommodating with people who are perhaps not very accommodating, especially in like the modern political climate. And I was actually kind of really impressed by how incisive this criticism could be sometimes, while still remaining very clever.
That's
so
great.
I like that.
And Donald? Hello? Donald there?
He may have stepped away for a moment.
Okay.
If I could interject for a second,
Go
and
ahead.
just to give almost a semi-generational perspective,
Mm-hmm.
right? I was a kid in the 1980s, and I grew up in a conservative synagogue, not a reform one. The first conservative woman rabbi was ordained in 1985. And it was a slow and fraught process, despite what the reform movement had already established, right? So in my community, we were fighting over whether or not women can read from the Torah at this time. We were fighting about whether women could lead services where men were at those same services, right? And I remember this till the early 90s, were these major debates within the movement. It's kind of past in the conservative movement, but just, to look at this is in one lifetime. Where for me growing up, it was jarring, and I had to get used to the idea, and I'm glad that I did, of course, women rabbis. It didn't feel natural and normal to me. And now, of course, it's normal. Some of my childhood friends grew up to be rabbis. There's that story in our textbook, I believe, which said that, a kid seeing a male rabbi and saying, "I didn't know that men could be rabbis."
The rabbis.
Right? And the rabbin is still disproportionately male, but it does show some change. So what you're looking at now, particularly also around LGBTQ issues, right? When I was growing up in the conservative movement, they eventually said that they made it acceptable to be gay in the community, then to be gay in the rabbinate, but you couldn't be bisexual, because if you were bisexual, you should choose to be straight, as if that's how bisexuality worked, right? And again, meaning choose a straight partner. It doesn't matter what you desire and whom you love. So just to give that little perspective, that what you're seeing now on Twitter and what you're hearing from Rabbi Winnig is really a long fought struggle from people like Rabbi Winnig, people like Sally Prisan, and countless others who've created this culture. I think it's also interesting to look at the Orthodox community, where they will not ordain women and do not ordain women for reasons that have to do with how they interpret halakha and tradition, where their attitude towards homosexuality can change. Now, we had a speaker on campus last year who uses the title Maharat. Rory Picker's niece was here. And that is, they've created a position which is essentially a female rabbi in the Orthodox Jewish community. And they are bound, they accept the same halachic strictures as every other woman does in the community. But what they've said is, if the main goal of a rabbi is to teach and to lead a community, there's nothing that women can't do in that regard. So I just want to give some generation, but also movemental positions, and we'll talk about movements a little bit later.
So I'm glad you talked about the Maharat situation. There are now women rabbis who have gone through what they call Yeshivat Maharat, which is the women's Orthodox yeshiva for ordination. And they've come finally to a position where they allow the women to choose the title that they want. And so for the past several years, women have been graduating from the Orthodox yeshiva and using the term rabbi, not Maharat. And I'm very proud that one of those is a young woman who went to preschool with my youngest son. And they became good friends. And when she entered into the training, now she comes from her father and his brothers, was the first generation in 5 generations that were not rabbis. They all became doctors. Poor unaccomplished men, they all became doctors. But when she was ordained, she decided, in honor of the rabbis of her family's history, that she would take the title rabbi to reinstate the rabbinic line in her family. What makes me really proud of that moment is that she actually wrote to me when she was entering into the program and said, you were the first woman rabbi I ever met. And you showed me that this could be possible. And she's now an Orthodox woman rabbi, which I'm happy to have spawned by my presence, anybody of any type that you want. And I think that's one of the interesting things that's happened even since I was ordained. When I went to my first rabbinic conference in 1981, the issue of people being openly gay and lesbian and being ordained was still a question. Because it always goes back to, well, what will the community think? What will the community think? You're breaking down the ideal. The ideal is blah, 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 and you're breaking the ideal. And of course, most of us said, well, there's plenty of people who aren't the ideal. We need to change our paradigm. And I will never forget that first year, I had a student who was in high school, and we were talking about whatever the topic was. And he came in one day and said, Rabbi Winnig, there are people who are gay who are rabbis, right? And I said, yes, there are. Although I will say at the time, I think everyone was still pretty much closeted in public about the issue. And when I was being ordained, I had a couple of colleagues who were gay who were terrified that somebody was going to out them in their placement process because it was not yet accepted at the time. But when this young man was talking, what he was really saying is, that means if I'm gay, that I could still be a rabbi. He was in 10th grade at the time. This was all, this is 1981. This is all very new stuff that was being talked about. And that's what, one of the things I find fascinating now is that our view of what is okay, what is right, what the right models are, what the paradigms should be, has certainly changed drastically. And we finally at the point where we're talking about people and human relationships rather than some stereotype about how one should be, or this paradigm that demands a role model be, only one thing, and not realizing that people need lots of role models. You need a role model who can be, the most enthusiastic tennis player, and you also want a role model who can be a great baker, You know, it turns out we need multiple role models in our lives. And one of the things I love about the modern rabbinate is we've got it in spades. We've got it. We've got so many people who are doing so many fascinating, interesting things and have different abilities. And that means that we're also able to reach more people because people can grasp onto a slightly different entry point into their lives. And I really think it's remarkable. And I really credit my institution, the Hebrew Union College, for having opened the doors to that view of Jewish life. Because I'll tell you, that was not the view of Jewish life I was raised with, and was not necessarily the view of Jewish life that I was educated in while I was in school. So it's a really nice thing to see this paradigm having opened as far as it is. So a couple of other things I want to talk about rabbis and the modern world and the modern community is that it's very challenging when you reflect a tradition that is over, 5,000 years old, that's been expressed in countries and cultures all around the world. To find the eternal truths, the eternity of what we teach, and also recognize that the modern world has evolved to a point where how we teach those things needs to change. So while we're talking about communities and models and leadership and things, of course, the Bible, the Hebrew Bible in and of itself has some laws that are quite restrictive about the way certain things are done in community. For instance, if you have a recalcitrant child who you can't control, you're allowed to stone them according to the Bible. Obviously, we may feel like that with some children that we encounter today, but if we did that, we'd be in jail pretty quickly in this country. And corporal punishment is no longer allowed in schools, even though it used to be. All of these things are different. So one of the things that, as a Reform rabbi, my job is to find these kernels of the eternal truths and to teach them in new ways. And I think that that is probably the best characteristic of where we are in the modern world, is trying to find the things that are meaningful in our tradition and give them new life in our world today. So for me, one of the very important parts of the Hebrew Bible is the story of the Exodus from Egypt. That story, the Exodus from Egypt, the Exodus from slavery to freedom, is a paradigm that informs pretty much everything I do on a daily basis. Because we're told in our tradition that we are supposed to feel ourselves as if we ourselves went forth from slavery to freedom. To remember that suffering and oppression is as real today as it was then. And that until we recognize that and bring freedom to all people, then we are somehow still enslaved, just like we were in Egypt. To me, that is an eternal truth, which means that I have an obligation as a Jew, as a rabbi, to help stop oppression wherever I see it, wherever it exists. That is a paradigm of teaching. It's not just for me, it's for all people. And we have other lines like treat the stranger as a citizen. Therefore, it is to me a Jewish obligation to help immigrants, to help people who are seeking refuge, people who are seeking their place in the world, just like my ancestors had to as well. And it doesn't matter to me why or where they come from. if they need help and they are running from oppression, then it's my obligation to help do that. The framework will be through my Jewish involvement for the most part, because that's who I am and that's what I do. But that is one of the things that really informs particularly the Reform Rabbinate, but rabbis in general, that we take these eternal truths of the Torah and don't just apply them to the way they were when they were written about in the Torah. I know there's a couple of these books that talk about the year that I lived biblically, or the year I did, this, and, and to me, some of that is a ludicrous experiment, because you can't possibly do it, because the world around us is not the same. If you're not trying to express your Jewish life while the Romans are trying to oppress you, or the Persians are coming to take away the, whatever, you're not living biblically. So, the way we live biblically is to take the truths of the Torah and move them forward in time. And that's what Judaism does through halakha. People say, well, halakha has always been done this way. Well, the actual truth is it has not. Halakha is reinterpreted for every generation. And I'll give you a perfect example of that. Next Friday is Rosh Hashanah. And our synagogue, like most synagogues around the world, are not meeting in person. Because the numbers that would want to assemble, and the rooms and the buildings and all of that, are not safe to do so. So we're coming up with all sorts of ways to do that. Well, for Reform rabbis, we've dived in and we use Zoom and we use all sorts of things. For Orthodox Jews, Zoom is a problem, because it means using electricity on the Sabbath when they generally don't use electricity. But they have this loophole. And the loophole is, if you start something before the Sabbath begins, or before the holiday begins, you can keep it running throughout the holiday. And then you don't have to, then you're not, you're not violating the law, because you're not creating the electricity on the day. So people started saying, oh, well, Zoom, fine. So we can turn Zoom on before the Sabbath begins, and then we can leave it on throughout. Well, there's a problem with that, because Zoom had a 24-hour limit on how long you could keep connected to any one meeting. And then they bounced you off. Well, the Sabbath rules require actually 25 hours, because you start 18 minutes before and you go until the sun sets, and then plus when the 3 stars appear. So that's about another hour is the way. So it's basically an hour and 18 minutes. So you actually need 25 hours and 18 minutes to make this all work. So a bunch of congregations and a bunch of people started writing to Zoom. And they got Zoom to agree, if you signed up in advance, that you could keep your meetings open for 27 hours, so that there would be a possibility for the holidays to be observed properly in community using Zoom. Still following Jewish law, but finding a way to make it work.
Are there microphones on? Because that would also mean that they're broadcasting their home for 25 hours.
Yep.
That has a restraint that my family did not.
I guess, I don't know. I honestly don't know how far people are taking it. I don't know if they're doing it from a synagogue building and then they'll go back to the building the next day. I don't know who's the people who are going that far. I'm not. Most of my colleagues are not. But I just thought that was it's a really fascinating thing. The discussion started back at Passover time, because Passover was in the first month after COVID restrictions came in, and Passover is a time when we get together as large families. And some of the Orthodox rabbis and conservative rabbis then said, if we start before, can we, we can have the Seder on. They didn't need the 24-hour thing. And other people said, no, you should be home alone regardless. And that became a whole discussion, which now led 6 months later to working out a way in their minds with Zoom that they could make the holiday work and be broadcast. Deborah, go ahead.
Yeah. In terms of using Zoom, isn't it considered work to push buttons on the computer?
So it's not the work. It's not work. It's
not
the
work.
electrical connection, which is like lighting fire. And that's what we
Okay.
don't do. As I said, I don't know. I'm not one who's doing it, so I don't know how far they're taking this. I'm just using it as an example where people are finding how to take what has been a long-standing prohibition and finding a way to work with it in the modern time. It's the same thing, by the way. I don't know if have any of you had to buy a refrigerator lately or an oven. But if you buy a new refrigerator or an oven, there are settings on them now, pretty much universal, that say the Shabbat settings, the Sabbath settings. So that, for instance, you can push a button on a refrigerator and the Sabbath setting will make certain that the light in the refrigerator doesn't go on when you open the door, because that was determined years and years ago to be a violation of the law of the Sabbath, because you're causing the light to go on when you open the door. So people would have to take out their light bulbs in their refrigerators on Fridays so that wouldn't happen. Now that's a setting. Same thing with ovens. They have that setting as well.
I would add to this that there's a long tradition of, they call these exceptions or ways of workarounds, heters, right?
Right.
There's a long tradition of doing this that goes back since rabbis were instituting halacha, that it's
Yes.
not only a process of the modern world. It's applied differently now, perhaps with communities that have different relationships to halacha. But this, remember, I told you the story about Maimonides and the Katlanit, the murderess, who found his way around to getting to officiating, having a marriage officiated that he himself would not have done, right? So that this is really part also of a very long tradition.
And this is the tradition that, as I said, nobody technically lives biblically, but everybody lives biblically, because we look at the tradition to see what it was teaching, what the essence was of it, and then we figure out what works. Another example of this is a very, very old debate between Rabbi, with a ruling that Rabbi Hillel gave, because in the Bible we have these laws about the Jubilee year, which is the 50-year cycle. Every 7 years you let the land lie fallow, and then 7 times 7 years is 49 years, so that would be a sabbatical year, and then the 50th year was the Jubilee year. So year 49 and 50, you also couldn't harvest the same way you would have in the other years. That becomes a whole problem, because when you have that 2 years of 1 year of not harvesting is one thing, 2 years is starting to become a crisis. So Rabbi Hillel had created this permission that you could set up a contract with somebody who was not Jewish and sell your land to that person for that year. And then it was not your land anymore. You were using the land, you were working for someone else at that time who wasn't bound by the same laws. And that way you could have enough food and harvest for your family. And this is a perfect example of the heter, the permission that was granted to be within the law, but still be able to move forward and make something happen that was necessary for the community. And this spirit is what has imbued Jewish law for all time. Because if Jewish law stayed exactly as it was, we would not have advanced, and we'd be as dead as all the other societies that were around us. from the Egyptians and the Zoroastrians to the most part, and the Greek, the Greek religious cults that were around, and they all disappeared. And Judaism is still here. Because we've adapted and had ways within our framework to make things go forward. And the modern day Zoom is just the newest example of taking a pattern of decision making to make it possible for us to live by the law. As a matter of fact, whenever the discussion comes up with some of these things, the rabbis, different people quote the passage, you should live by the laws, and that you're not supposed to put yourself in a position that you can't stand. In fact, the rabbis used to say when there was a big dispute, well, we should do this or we should do that. One of the comments in the rabbinic text is, go and see what the people are doing and let's rule accordingly. Because I knew that people make adaptations to things, sometimes unwittingly, because it's just what works. And they wanted to make certain that they didn't make laws that made it too difficult to live by them. And so that's what we continue to do to make Judaism relevant and live in our world today. But there's always boundaries. There's always there's certain things that we're just not going to change as well, because that would take us outside of the Jewish context. And every so often there's big fights between the different types of Jews over what those boundaries are and where we can set them. Professor Lebenz, you want to say something?
Yeah, I want to ask a question of you, right? So those boundaries are interesting, right? And so in some regards, there's a tolerance, I think, in American society of the knowledge that we have these boundaries, right? For the most part, the movements understand, right? Not all of Orthodoxy accepts Maharat and women rabbis, but they also know that conservative and Reform Jews are Jews. We have women rabbis. There's really not a street fighting because there are enough buildings to separate us out. My question for you actually has to do with the halachic system, right? So within Reform Judaism, we've studied and we'll study again that in some ways, and Reform too has changed, but Reform began with a feeling that the halachic system was of a time and accomplished something for the Jewish community, and we have moved past it. The conservative movement considers itself a halachic movement, but most conservative Jews do not observe Jewish law, right? So at what are we now, or at least part of the Jewish community, so in a post-halachic framework? That is to say, even when I observe something, I'm not doing it out of a sense, I don't check the Shulchan Aruch, which they've studied about. I don't check the Shulchan Aruch to see what I should do. I hold it because it's a cultural tradition. And I'm wondering two things. Are part of us living in a post-halachic world? And if we are, what does that do to the role of the rabbi in that world? For instance, I may turn to you for advice, but I don't normally turn to rabbis for arbitration of how I should practice my Judaism.
So you've raised a bunch of questions, all in there. The biggest thing, I don't know, as Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan has said, halakha should have a vote, not a veto. So that we look to it to inform us. But if the situation has changed, then we need to look for a solution that works with the same moral framework. So one example, of course, is slavery, right? The Bible's got slaves all over the place. It's got certain rules and respect, and I can easily state that the rules that were put in place for the proper treatment of slaves was meant specifically to try to keep people from having slaves, because if you were restricted in what you could do and how you could do it, generally it meant that they knew that there was a problem with the institution. Well, one of my professors always said, there's no law in the Bible that didn't need to be there. It's not speculation. The laws are there because they saw things that needed to be regulated. There is nobody today who would say, I would hope, the Bible says you can have slaves, so if I treat my slave well, I can have a slave. So in that way, are we post-halachic because we're saying you can tell us how we should properly treat our slaves, but we're still don't think it's moral and right to own slaves? Or are we halachically dealing with the modern interpretation that we don't live, in former days, taking slaves usually came about as spoils of war, and it was to keep people from being killed, and you kept them alive, and you could justify it all sorts of ways biblically, and not one of them would hold in today's world. So is that post-halachic, or is that just understanding that halakha's commitment in the Bible to those rules and even to later times just simply cannot apply in today's world? But the morality that we're taught about human relationships, even to subservient people, and how we have to respect them and treat them when we are in positions of power and somebody has lesser power, I think it's still a very important halachic concept. And so I think there's many ways that we're still very much entrenched in halakha, but we understand what halakha gets to do to our lives differently, and how we're bound by it. And I will say, the late Professor Jacob Pedakowski used to always, who was an expert on Jewish law, we used to go to synagogues and people would say to him, I'm not so religious, or I'm not this, or I don't keep Jewish law. Or what. He said, did you murder somebody recently? Did you steal? Do you commit adultery regularly? He said, if you're actually following those laws, you're as halachic as anybody else. And what we're talking about when we talk about some of these these halakha differences, is they happen to be matters of ritual, not morality. So whether somebody uses electricity on Shabbat or not, that's a ritual-ish matter. But are you still respecting Shabbat? Are you still keeping the Sabbath and making it special in your home? So is that post-halachic? Is that ignoring halakha? And I remember when I was in Israel, I used to go to this laundromat, and there were there was a neighborhood laundromat, so there were other rabbinical students from the Reform movement who were using the same laundromat, and this guy would chat with all of us. And we would talk about these things. You go to do laundry in Israel, you talk about Jewish law and Bible. This is what, this was the way of life in Jerusalem at the time. And he would ask me to explain things. He said, well, how do you decide this? Or how do you decide that? Or how do you do that? He says, it's much harder being a Reformed Jew than being Orthodox. Because he would do what people told him. And this is what you referred to a little while ago, Professor Lebens, where you said, you don't go to the rabbi for decision making. Well, Orthodox Jews do go to rabbis for decision making. And they have to pick a rabbi, and they have to stick with that rabbi. And if that rabbi says, this is not the custom in our community, it's not the custom in that community if you want to stay in the community, because you are meant to follow that rabbi's rulings. You have to accept it, and sometimes people don't like it, and then they're stuck because they chose to identify with that situation, and they have to do it. Sometimes you leave, but it's a very common, depending upon which group you're part of, how much the rabbi or the group influences your life is different. Some are very, very restrictive, and some are much more open. And give room for people to grow and things. And one of the things I will say, that I respect a lot of my Orthodox colleagues who have come a very long way, from when I knew them 30 and 40 years ago. Sometimes I get kind of mad because they said things and they did things 30 and 40 years ago that they would never say or do today. And that's growth, and that's wonderful. But we are ever evolving. And that's part of the miracle to me of Judaism, is that we evolve within a framework that allows us to still be identified as the Jewish people. And it's complicated, and we argue about it, and we fight about it, but it's still true. Next Friday, despite everything, we are all going to celebrate Rosh Hashanah. We are all going to begin the new year on the same day at the same time across the country. And it's a pretty miraculous thing that despite COVID, it's still going to happen. And we're going to still make this new year meaningful. And you asked me to talk about some of the things we're doing. So we are going to be Zooming sorry, we're not Zooming. We are going to be live streaming pre-recorded services for 4 services: the evening of Rosh Hashanah, the morning of Rosh Hashanah, the evening of Yom Kippur, and the morning of Yom Kippur. Those services will be live streamed to both Facebook and our congregational website. We're having a live service next Friday at 6 for a Rosh Hashanah Seder, which is following the Sephardic tradition of having special symbolic foods and blessings for the beginning of the new year. We'll be doing that at 6. And on Saturday afternoon, there's a custom of symbolically throwing your sins away by using bird seed or breadcrumbs or things to throw away your sins and the new year. And we're actually gathering in person, but in a large outdoor space to be participating in that service together. And we will have the shofar blowing done at the same time. Matter of fact, I was going to find my shofar. Oh, there it is. And we'll be doing the shofar blowing outside in person. We're going to go to an apple orchard on Sunday and have services for our younger families. Yom Kippur afternoon, we're having services evening and morning that'll be pre-recorded. In the afternoon, we're having TED Talk services with some of our congregants weighing in on the issues in their lives today. We'll be doing some other live services on the afternoon of Yom Kippur. And then we are concluding our holiday at 7:30 at I never remember which the name of the movie theater is, but we're going to the drive-in movies. And we'll have the final ceremonies of Yom Kippur. And then we're all watching Fiddler on the Roof together to begin the new year. So we're trying to make these holidays not just the same as they've always been, just being delivered differently. We're also embracing the change and doing some new things to get ourselves together. I did tell Professor Lebens that, if you let us know and you want to come in on first of all the services that will be live streamed, you don't need anything from us. You can just go to the Facebook page or the website to see them. But any of the Zoom programs, and you can go to our website to get the whole schedule that you want to participate in. When you just have to email our office and they'll send you the link. Unfortunately, because of Zoom bombers who have done some really horrific things during congregational worship, we keep all of our links private and we don't post the links. But everything we do afterwards, like every Friday night, we're on Zoom and we're on Facebook. And now we'll also be going towards our website as well. You can always see them either live or the recordings are always available to you.
And I've just thrown the website into the chat if anybody wants to grab it. I want to thank Rabbi Winnig very much for coming to class. This was really fantastic. I think it's a really wonderful opportunity, as you've said, to sort of take advantage of the innovations that are forced upon us by COVID. And I've never been able to bring in guest speakers like this before. So I really appreciate your time. I don't know if you guys appreciate how busy this time is for rabbis and what it means for Rabbi Winnig to have taken an hour out of her busy schedule to meet with us. So I thank you very much, and I wish you a Shana Tova.
I brought my shofar though, so I wanted to at least do the shofar blast since you So if you don't know, apples and honey are always a part of Rosh Hashanah for a sweet new year. So that's why I have the apple and honey behind me. And one of the most important parts of greeting the new year is the shofar. The shofar is always a ram's horn. By the way, there are female sheep that have horns. Just need to clarify that. But I used to raise sheep, so it's an important correction for me. So this is a shofar. It's a completely natural horn. You can see there's no metal, there's nothing on it. You can always tell a woman rabbi's shofar because there's always lipstick on the end of it. Although I suppose there are some men I know who wear lipstick too. But anyhow, so this is a sound of shofar. Traditionally, there's 100 blasts of the shofar made up of 3 different notes: the tekiah, the teruah, and the shavarim. One clear note, one that is 3 notes that are broken notes, and one that's the staccato range of 9 to 11 notes. And when you multiply that all together and you do it the prescribed number of times, it turns out to be 100. And the big thing at the end is the tekiah gedolah, and the tekiah gedolah is supposed to be as long and as big as you can do. And so I'll just give you a taste of the notes. So, and then you greet each other with a good year. And I know for many people, it's a good time to adopt the Jewish custom of starting a new year, because we certainly need a fresh start in the middle of what this past year has been. So we wish you all a happy and healthy new year. May it be a year of peace for all of us and safety and security for all the world. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
My
Thank you.
pleasure.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Everybody.